Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the SoftCo webinar. Garret and I can see there are still folks continuing to trickle in, so we'll be very polite this morning. We'll just hold for another few seconds, give everyone a chance to join us, and we'll kick things off momentarily. So if you bear with us for another few seconds, we'd very much appreciate it. Alrighty, I have us at over 1 minute past the hour, so we'll kick things off. Good morning or good afternoon, folks, depending on where you're joining us from today. As I said, you're all very welcome to the SoftCo webinar. We're delighted to have you on with us here today. By way of introduction, my name is Adam McDonagh. I am one of the AP P2P Specialists here in SoftCo, having been with the organization for over 11 years. And I'm also delighted to be joined and to introduce my esteemed colleague, Garret Pearse. Garret leads our global pre-sales function and brings tremendous amount of value and experience with over 2 decades in the AP P2P space, working with some very large global and complex organizations, including the likes of Patagonia, Logitech, and KPMG, just to name a few. Garret, you're very welcome. Thank you very much for jumping on. How are you doing today?
Always, always a pleasure, Adam. Yeah, thanks very much. Looking forward to talking today. Yeah, it's been busy. It's been exciting lately with all the stuff going on. So yeah, looking great to have a chance to talk about supplier controls today. So thanks for having me on.
Super, well, do appreciate it, and looking forward to picking your brain and having a productive conversation. Folks, just before we jump right in, we'll get the boring kind of housekeeping bit out of the way early on, and then we'll dive right into the topic at hand. There is a very large audience joining us from all over the globe, which is fantastic to see. Given that you are placed in listen-only mode, but Garret and I do want this session to be as interactive as possible for you, and ultimately maximizing your time and ensuring that we provide value as part of today's webinar. So if there are any questions, any comments, any feedback, etc., that you'd like to send through to us, there is a chat section on the webinar control panel, which should have appeared on your screen when you joined today's session. We would encourage you to utilize that. Be sure to submit questions directly to us. We'll either address them during the course of today's webinar, or as you can see there on the agenda slide, we'll also have time at the end to answer questions. So be sure to submit them through us, and we'll answer them as part of the overall session today. Just to maybe set the scene and kind of give you a sense of what it is that we're going to be talking about. So ultimately what we're discussing is, I suppose, a challenge that sits right at the intersection of AP efficiency, supplier management, and ultimately payment risk. And that's, as we all know, and as we're all learning and seeing daily, that's the growing exposure of fraud and the risk that finance teams are facing when perhaps their supplier controls aren't as tight or as connected as they should be. And I suppose for most organizations, the risk isn't one big dramatic failure. It's usually a result of numerous things and small different gaps in their process. So whether that's changes to supplier bank details and payment details, it could be manual onboarding steps and validations, disconnected systems or approvals, or even outdated records. And the reality is, as AP becomes faster, more streamlined, more automated, those control gaps and those issues can scale actually just as quickly. So purpose today is really about looking at where those risks tend to appear for organizations across the supply lifecycle, the key things that finance and AP leaders should be watching out for and keeping an eye on and be conscious and cognizant of, and ultimately how stronger supplier controls can reduce your exposure and risk of fraud without ultimately slowing the business down. So, Garret, if we move into kind of the first slide, if you don't mind. So, yeah, I can see that there. So, folks, when we look at where supplier controls actually fail in the real world, and that's based on what we're seeing for customers and prospective customers alike, it's rarely because, and Garret, we know this, it's not because organizations have no process whatsoever, right? It's usually the opposite. There are processes in place. Now, they may be quite manual, they might be quite cumbersome, But ultimately, the breakdown happens in between the handover. So the handovers and questions and queries between different teams, between different systems, or during moments perhaps where people step outside of that actual onboarding and approval workflow. And that's maybe where there's rush payment requests or urgent payment requests coming into the business. And hopefully a lot of the examples that we're sharing here on screen will feel quite familiar to the AP and finance teams listening and joining us today. And if you look at them, that's where supplier changes and requests are coming in manually via email. It's where urgent requests, those kind of urgent payment requests, and are bypassing controls. We talked a little bit about kind of manual processes. So manual maybe rekeying, entry into the ERP systems, etc. Unclear ownership, or where you have multiple different systems in place and they're quite siloed. And individually, these might seem quite manageable, but collectively, if we look at them, they do create fragmentation. That's ultimately, Garret, where visibility and control starts to leak and to worsen. So based on your experience, I know you're talking to organizations day in, day out, and this is a hot topic, as you've mentioned. Where do you tend to see the biggest gaps emerge in practice?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the organizations I speak to, like you said, they'll have a process in place, but often it's stuck together with PDF forms that they're sending out and then getting back in via email. It's Excel, it's even paper forms, which will ultimately make its way into the ERP to set up the supplier. But there's so many manual steps. So as you said, lack of visibility there, that it really is exposing companies to something going awry, whether it be fraudulently or just through innocent mistake, that leads them to be exposed to setting up a vendor with incorrect payment data, with fraudulent payment data, with incorrect compliance data. So it's not just solely around payments, but that's obviously where the biggest exposure is. And I think what we see is these processes have worked reasonably well over the years, but where they start to creak is they've been attacked on a number of fronts. You have volume increasing, the workload on AP staff is increasing, which means the pressure to do things quickly and maybe not spend the same time as they would have before to check everything is correct is greater. You're prone to very legitimate looking phishing attacks where an email comes in from what looks like the CEO saying we need to pay this vendor ASAP to this bank account. And we're getting wiser to them, but you're always running the risk of somebody being under pressure and getting caught out, and the attacks are more and more sophisticated. So they will very quickly find a hole in any process. So it's trying to put a proper, controlled, audited, visible compliance structure around this very necessary part of the process, both from onboarding and beyond. And we'll talk about beyond in a few moments, that you need to be protected from. And that's where, and this, when you think about it, from an AP point of view, your supplier record is critical to everything you do. It's who the POs are being raised with. It's who you're ordering from. It's who's invoicing you. It's who you're ultimately paying. It's who you have the relationship with. So when you peel away everything that an AP team might be doing around just invoice processing, which is your day-to-day focus, it all comes back to having confidence in all of your supplier master data information.
Yeah, and you've mentioned, Garret, obviously growing volume and the demands on the AP, the vendor management teams, procurement teams, etc. There's also global complexities. So we see many organizations again acting in silos, so they might have different kind of onboarding approval mechanisms and documents, etc., that are being filled out depending on the geographies or countries in question. And you've mentioned that we are becoming wiser to the fact that fraud is happening, and everyone, I suppose, is aware of it. And I actually was listening to a podcast recently, and it was someone framed it as the 800-pound elephant in the room that we all know about, we don't really talk about. The other complexity is obviously the advancements in AI, which can prove to be very effective across supplier lifecycle management, procure to pay, AP, etc. But it also gives these kind of scammers and hackers a lot more sophistication behind the scenes in terms of being able to break down the barriers and some of the kind of gaps in your process as well.
Yeah, I mean, there was a recent case of a finance manager being told via video conference to go and make a payment. It turns out it was an AI generated video. It wasn't really the CEO who was on the call with him. It was an AI generated image of the CEO. So yeah, so what you want to be able to do is have a process that you can pull back on and say, no, this is the way it should be done. if you have that process in place, it also should help with the efficiency, that you're no longer scrambling to do things. And I think a lot of the areas where you become vulnerable is when things are having to be done in a rush, because that's the way you've had to do business, because you're under pressure, because you don't have the automation, because you don't have the systems in place. And it's that creates the environment in which these events can take place.
Yeah, absolutely. Just giving you time back to be able to assess and analyze and dissect what you're being asked to do so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of what we've been talking about, if I'm moving on there, is getting the onboarding process right. I think that's something we were talking about, that it starts with a good solid process. And I think where it's the ongoing relationship there, where you're exposed, where you have what looks like an email from a legitimate existing supplier asking to change the payment details, that you can be caught out. And you can also slow up legitimate change requests as well. What we've seen operated, you and I, Adam, in some countries where there's been some banking changes, which has led to a lot of changes of bank details, which has flooded AP teams with legitimate change requests, but it's very hard to sift through. So I don't want it all to be about, it's not all about fraudulent attempts. It's a key part of it. It's also being able to manage the legitimate traffic of legitimate changes in a way that gives you confidence that they're being done correctly.
Yeah, I think that's one massive misconception, Garret, is that that AP and supplier onboarding and kind of verification process is a one-time event. There's kind of probably a lot of due diligence that goes into a new supplier on request, so they get onboarded. Bank details are checked and validated. Kind of the screening process is completed, and at that stage, there people tend to kind of rest, if you like, for want of a better word, and kind of you think your control work is done, but actually, as you've mentioned, a huge proportion of the exposure and risk happens thereafter. So, those supplier data change requests are coming in, dormant vendors or suppliers that have been inactive for a period of time maybe get reactivated. We know from our day-to-day dealings with global clients, there's multiple different systems. So you have an ERP system with the vendor master, supplier master file, but you may have other fragmented systems, PO systems, purchasing systems, etc., where records exist with vendor and supplier details, and there may be a misalignment of those. So that's, I suppose, what makes things highly challenging, is that in their own they don't look high risk operationally, but actually the risk magnifies itself during kind of normal day-to-day activities. I think it goes back to your point about being able to have an efficient process where you have time to actually check and validate what you're being asked to do, rather than everything being rushed and urgent to carry out your tasks and processes.
Yeah, I mean, to give you maybe some examples where I've come across it, is multi-country organizations where they have a relationship with the supplier in multiple countries, means they lose track of the details, maybe get updated in one country but don't get updated in another. You got multi entities within your organization dealing with them. So it can even be simple mistakes, that you fail to update all of the bank details for all of the suppliers you've set up, as you're all ultimately against the one organization you're buying from. And that can lead to payments going to the old account or getting lost or held up. So it's not just the fraudulent payments. As I said, it can be that you delay paying a key supplier because you haven't been able to keep their details up to date, and next thing you're on hold from a supply point of view. So it can have operational impacts as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a lot of kind of, I suppose, what we're seeing is, I think what you'd said is, we have a process. Everywhere we talk to has a process, but when you pick away, you find that there's it's manual, it's slow, it's prone to error.
And yeah, absolutely, Garret. And you've mentioned some of it as well. The likes of PDF forms you might be sharing out, Excel spreadsheets to populate, vendor supplier information. And there is a process in place, albeit it might not be perfect, but at least teams are should be adhering to kind of the process and policies that they've established. But I think that the real test of a control environment, sorry, excuse me, is not whether there's a process that exists first and foremost, but it's actually, can you validate and stand over it and prove it? So in essence, what happened, who approved the change or the request, what changed, and whether you did follow the correct controls and policies and frameworks that you've established. And it becomes more complex when you have the auditors stepping into the room and they're not asking, did you have a process? They don't really in reality care about the process. It's ultimately their questions are, can you prove it happened properly? And when something does go wrong, and we know it happens, and to your point, it doesn't have to be fraud exposure. It could be a payment issue, supplier control failure that impacts the supplier relations, access to raw materials, productions, etc., which has a huge consequence around revenue and kind of revenue yielding opportunities. That's when your CFO steps in, or your CEO steps in, or even kind of senior stakeholders around the board level, and they're asking, why did this not happen properly? So to me, I suppose that feels like a difference between our process compliance and kind of that true control and visibility that we've referenced. From your experience, how do you see organizations bridging that gap or closing that gap in practice?
Yeah. I think, the triggers, like you said, are audit is the auditors. In a good scenario, the auditors saying you got exposure here, or worse, the CFO asking why did something catastrophic happen or something go wrong. I think where we can start to then deal with it is by putting something in place which answers these questions that you should, whatever supplier management process you have in place, what system you have in place, you should be very clear as to where did this request come from, who are they, do we know that they're definitely who they say they are, who and how has approved it, in terms of saying, yeah, we're happy with the information provided, we're happy to update our records wherever that is, and what validations have we been able to apply, how we verified this change, how we validated that this company bank details we've now got are actually related to this company, that the new company we're onboarding that claims they are this company and have this address and this tax number, that they are definitely who they say they are. So it's having something that gives you comfort, and we're seeing that branch out into other areas of validation, your OFAC checks and things, to make sure that they are somebody you want to be dealing with as well. They may be exactly who they say they are, but we want to make sure that reputationally and compliance wise that they're an organization you should be dealing with. So you want to make sure you can answer these three questions clearly.
Yeah, and just on that, Garret, and for the folks in the room, would you recommend and suggest that companies and organizations go through a screening process, like maybe a kind of a test process with this? Should they submit a supplier request and see how it's handled and managed internally? Would you
I
recommend
mean, we have had companies where they've gone through a kind of a false flag kind of operation from somebody within their organization, trying to see could they bypass controls and do a check. I mean, it can be a bit severe, but I mean, ultimately, as a finance manager, you want to know that if that were to happen, whether it was somebody just from your own company doing a kind of penetration test, shall we say, or a genuine bad actor trying to do something, you would want to know that you were protected against that and that you had the processes in place to weed that out and stop it happening.
I think it's that fine line, right? You don't want to be doing it to try and catch people out, but I know if it was me, I'd rather be caught out in a test scenario than a true life example as well. So.
Yeah. I think the way to do it is make sure that the test scenario you catch it out before it catches you out.
Yeah, exactly.
Where you want to be.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So I suppose, Garret, we've talked about so far in today's webinar is kind of the challenges that organizations are experiencing. So we've mentioned fragmented processes, inconsistent controls, audit and kind of traceability issues. The next logical question that we get asked from customers and prospective clients alike is, what does a stronger control framework actually look like in practice, and what does an effective supplier lifecycle management or vendor lifecycle management tool do for me? So based on kind of your experience working with those global organizations, can you maybe walk us through how those capabilities help organizations strengthen their supplier controls from a day-to-day operational standpoint?
Yeah, I think the first thing is having a strict process. And again, you don't want it to be a barrier to doing business efficiently. It should be the opposite, but you want to have proper controls where you have visibility, you have consistency in terms of how the people go through the process. You need to have your your business users educated as the way they should do it. You should not have the scenario, which we have encountered, where the first thing finance know about a new supplier is they get an invoice in. That's a complete failure of process. So you need to have, this is the process we go through to onboard a new supplier. In support of that, you want to be able to efficiently get the information from those suppliers to get them on board. It shouldn't be a one size fits all. Every customer of ours has different types of suppliers. You don't need the same amount of detail from the company who's providing the coffee and tea in your cafeteria to provide the same level of details as IT provider. You want to be able to get different levels of validation and information from those. So there's where you want some dynamism in your onboarding forms and process, dynamism in who gets to review those requests, so your approval and validation workflows, validating who they are in terms of, as I said, bank and tax verification. You want to know that they are who they say they are. And again, that's I see that extending out into further checks as well, in terms of credit checks, OFAC checks, things like that. Having the comfort of audit history, so if anybody asks who did what, why, and when, that you have a full, transparent, uneditable history of what's happened, and ultimately getting that data security into your ERP or ERP. So being able to basically have your supplier lifecycle management process sit on front of your ERP and guard it to make sure that nothing gets changed in there without it going through a proper process. That's what good looks like. And it can be complex, it can be challenging, but the end goal is something that's going to be far better than the exposure that you may be open to at the moment.
Yeah. And Garret, it's not just that exposure. To your point, I think you mentioned this earlier on in the webinar. It's the ongoing benefits of having clean supplier data too. It's the correct, mechanisms of PO conformance, adherence to pricing specifications, etc. It's the AP natural improvements that you'll get from clean supplier data as well, in terms of being able to match those invoices to purchase orders back to the vendor details, etc. So it's highly important from a control standpoint, obviously mitigating and reducing the risk of fraud in the business, but there's wider benefits around having that clean supplier data that we know across the business.
Yeah, I mean, it's a discipline and it's a way of helping. It's part of the process is cleaning up your supplier database to start off with, but then having it kept clean from then on, and allowing you to do that in a way. And ultimately having it look something like we see here. So this is the kind of, don't want to say the gold standard, but it is what every company should aspire to in some means or other, that any new requests start with a controlled workflow, that initial internal users provide the information that's required in a secure way. That step 2 could be an opportunity to weed out some applications for new suppliers. Maybe you already have a supplier who provides that. So to your point about cleaning up your supplier database, one of the biggest things that clogs up a supplier database is adding suppliers that you don't really need, adding a new recruitment provider when you already have somebody who already provides those exact same services with no difference. And then getting it on front of your supplier in a secure, controlled way, having that the data that they submit back into you checked, giving all of your internal people a chance to review it. And what we see is, in a manual world, that might be one person in a finance team, but ideally you might want a number of departments involved. You might want a procurement department, you might want a compliance department, you might want an IT department, depending on the type of supplier request there is. And you want to make sure you can get it to those people in an efficient way. Highlight anything that's either breaks a business rule or a compliance or a security rule. Capture that all, but ultimately only allow valid supplier data to get added or updated within your ERP. So I don't know if that all makes sense to you, Adam, in terms of what good looks like. I think before we kind of summarize, I thought it might be useful just to talk a little bit about where that all sits in the bigger picture of AP. So I'm not going to give a product demo, but I just thought it would be interesting. Everything we've talked about here, if you look at what a typical SoftCo solution looks like with our demo company, Carter Group, You can be managing your world across multiple sub-entities within your organization, multiple jurisdictions. You'll see it's not a coincidence that the first module there that we show is supplier management, because that sits central to everything. If you get that in place, that will support your procurement process. You can liaise with them from an e-invoicing, EDI management point of view. Your AP automation process will flow. Your analytics will be able to help you far better. You can do things like statement reconciliation, your payment process, it supports your payment process. So getting this piece of your process right just enables so much better control and efficiency and everything else that circles around it, from procurement to payables to payment itself. So I just wanted to kind of give the context that supplier management is the pillar upon which everything really ultimately sits.
Certainly fits into a broader picture, which we've already discussed. The other thing, Garret, I'm conscious of, and again, it's very, very topical, and it's plastered all over here, is AI, right? And it's, everyone's talking about AI, and there's a fear about AI too. And it's important that we start asking those questions and validating those things early on. I think there's important considerations as well when organizations embark on a journey of maybe selecting a solution. So, is the AI auditable? Is it traceable? Can you stand over the decisions? If you're introducing your auditors into the process, will they be able to make sense of it? Other important considerations is your data isolated or is it shared, right? There's kind of a responsible use of AI as well. And there's also then kind of the fear around AI in terms of, is it going to remove jobs and is it going to remove tasks? And ultimately, if you look at AI, particularly across the lens of supplier lifecycle management and the procure to pay function and the AP function, AI approval doesn't remove the need for control. It ultimately changes where that control sits. So, we've talked about it. The confidence scores need to be auditable. The matching logic needs to be explainable. It needs to be something that you can stand over, that your auditors can make sense of. And the supplier history at the time of the AI decision needs to be retrievable on demand. So if someone is looking into how you came to a conclusion to onboard a supplier, how you came to a conclusion to pay an invoice, that data is readily available to you and you can make sense of where the AI came to its decision and conclusion to transact the payment or to onboard the new vendor request. And I think that's an important consideration that, yes, it's being asked about, but it can often be overlooked. And AI sometimes can nearly be a checkbox or a tick box. Do you have AI? Yes, we do. Okay, great. Let's move on. So just be inquisitive, be mindful, be conscious of how AI is being leveraged within the applications that you're reviewing, what that means for your data and whether that data is shared. And from an audit and traceability standpoint, how easy is it to conclude how AI came to a decision? Because you don't want to make, the audit periods are nightmares in and of itself. We don't want to make them more tricky or more complex for the teams that are navigating those.
Yeah. I mean, we had an interesting talk with our head of engineering last week around using AI in processes like AP, like supplier management. And you really need to have your eyes open as to exactly what the AI is doing on your behalf and make sure that it's implemented in a way. AI is fantastically powerful. It can also be fantastically wrong if you haven't deployed it correctly. You can give it the same piece of data twice and get two different decisions if you're not careful about how your modeling is set up, how your training data is used, what restrictions, what guardrails you have on it. So we're very keen to embed AI in whatever processes it will provide meaningful, secure benefit to our customers in, but we do that with some very clear guardrails that our AI architect has defined in terms of making sure it's got human in the loop, that it's got traceability, it's got auditability, it's not making outlandish decisions that you're going, how the heck did it come to that?
Yeah, well, definitely an important consideration just to touch on. Okay, great. So maybe just to bring everything together then, folks, Garret, I think you've kind of a wrap-up slide.
Yeah. I'm just going to, just before we wrap that up, we're just going to throw out a couple of poll questions that I meant to trigger earlier on in the process. But just to kind of understand, if you could just take a moment or two to answer where your biggest risks are and what you see as your current organization's processes, that would be very helpful to us. So maybe just take a moment. Your poll should appear in your meeting control that you have there. So if you could take a moment to answer that, that would be very much appreciated. While that's there, yeah, I think let's kind of summarize where we are.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of, for me anyway, Garret, and feel free to jump in here if I'm speaking out of turn or I've missed anything. But obviously, one of the key themes today is that supplier control is an ongoing process. So it's not just a one-time onboarding exercise. It is an ongoing life cycle responsibility for organizations. And we know, and we discussed in most organizations, their real exposure tends to happen at those various different handover points. So between different siloed systems, different global teams, different countries, different jurisdictions. It may not even be different countries, could just be different organizations or entities, departments within the business domestically as well. And during moments where processes become more fragmented or rushed, so we talked about kind of rushed and urgent payment requests and things like that, and AP and the wider team not having time to maybe validate claims or to take a step back and understand what's being truly asked of them. We also discussed, I suppose, the difference between having a process in place and most organizations have an element of some sort of process. We mentioned it might not be perfect, so it still can be quite manual, it still can be quite cumbersome and fraught with risks and pitfalls. But the use of manual PDF forms, spreadsheets, email validation, etc. But actually having a process in place that you can stand over and been able to evidence that the right controls actually happen. So for, again, going back to traceability and audit, that you can stand over exactly how you came to that decision and that realization. Because ultimately, when finance leaders, auditors, AP teams, anyone is under pressure, that traceability and visibility ultimately becomes critical to the organization. And that's hopefully where people get a sense joining today's webinar, where a really structured and defined supplier lifecycle management solution or vendor lifecycle management solution can truly make a difference. So bringing about kind of consistency, the correct validations, third-party verifications that you've mentioned earlier, Garret, the likes of following kind of strict and defined approval hierarchies and workflows, and that auditability, right? So being able to trace back to those decision points. And I think if you look at the screen and if people can see it there, I think the one line on it that probably summarizes this best is, the strongest AP teams are not necessarily the ones with the most steps. They're the ones that can confidently stand over every critical supplier change. So I don't know if I've missed anything that, Garret, anything further you wanted to add before we hand over, obviously, poll results and look at the Q&A?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's, I think a lot of the attendees have indicated it's the onboarding processes where their biggest risk is at the moment, and those data changes. I've just stuck another poll up there around what evidence could you provide today, so maybe just take a moment to answer that. But yeah, I think you've covered all the main things. There is a little assessment you can do online. You can see the link there, apcontrols.softco.com. If you were to take a few minutes, it will give you a good kind of score as to where you are on that. And again, we'd be happy to talk you through and do a further deep dive in terms of a AP, what we call an AP maturity assessment, with you to really give you some insights as to where you are at the moment, where you could get to in the short term, medium term, long term, to put all of the controls in place that will make you a efficient, secure, compliant part of the business. Just also a couple of questions that come in there. Might just
there's a few there, Garret, for you. So first one, if you don't mind, how do you add stronger supplier controls without slowing down urgent payments?
Yeah, I think you need to have technology that supports efficiency to make it clear to people who are involved in the steps that they get the information in front of them, that they can easily see all the information they've been asked to assess, that they have that backed up with automatic, like you said, external validations, that they know what information that has been validated externally has been validated. And I think you also need to take a step back and say, what is the source of these urgent payments? Why do we have urgent payments? Is that an indication of a problem with our process and inefficiency in our process anyway, that people aren't following the right steps, that people are trying to bypass it? We frequently say that AP clean up the mess created by the other departments. This is an opportunity to say, no, we put the systems in place to allow us to do it efficiently. Let's not keep doing things where we end up having to pay somebody at the last minute because a buyer didn't do things the right way around and we're now scrambling to make a payment on time. Urgent payments tend to be an indicator of something that's gone wrong elsewhere in the process. And yet, while they will happen, you want to minimize those and have a proper process around them.
And damage limitation and control. There's another question there for you, Garret. How big of a risk are duplicate supplier records?
Yeah, I mean, it's all muddying the water in terms of who you should be paying. It leads to mistakes. It leads to confusion. It leads to POs being issued to the wrong buying organization or wrong buyer supplier, and then when it comes to payment, you might have the wrong details for one of the duplicate supplier records. So if you can put controls, use this as an opportunity to clean up your supplier database, deduplicate, remove dormant suppliers. That is all feeding into making for a more secure, more efficient process.
Perfect. I think that is all the questions, unless I've missed any there, Garret, that you can see.
No, I think that's good.
Okay. So I think just to folks, thanks once again for dialing in and joining us here on today's webinar. We hope you found it helpful and beneficial. As Garret mentioned, and just echo what he said, there is a free tool to utilize, and there is a link there on the bottom left of your screen for a short maturity assessment. It takes less than 5 minutes to complete. As I said, it's completely free to use, and it will give you a good sense of where you are in your own AP control today, and perhaps maybe some initiatives that you can undertake to improve that score. And we will also follow up with each of you individually, so would welcome any feedback on today's session. We're more than happy to schedule and tailor more personalized and deeper demos for you. So myself, Garret, or one of the wider SoftCo team members will certainly be in touch, and we hope to hear from you very soon. So thanks once again for joining us. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And Garret, thanks once again for joining me here. Do appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, folks. Take care.
Bye now.
See you. Bye-bye.